Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive right in and demystify the incredible, often misunderstood, works of Sylvia Plath. We're looking at how she brilliantly captured a descent into mental illness, all set against the incredibly suffocating expectations of the 1950s. You know, Plath is this absolute literary giant, but her life and her tragic death have often entirely overshadowed her actual writing. So today, we're focusing strictly on what she put on the page. We're going to dissect the cultural pressures she was writing about, her absolute genius use of metaphor, and the raw, undeniable power of her prose and poetry. Let's get into it.
Before we go any further, just take a look at this quote. I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am. This is such an iconic line from Plath's only novel, The Bell Jar, and it perfectly anchors our journey today. It establishes this haunting, raw sense of emotional survival that's right at the core of Plath's narrative. It's literally a heartbeat, right? A biological rhythm of survival that reminds us that beneath the really heavy themes of depression and societal alienation she tackles, there's this stubborn, profound desire just to exist, just to endure.
Okay, part one. The 1950s female ideal and the Cold War expectation. Let's establish the baseline cultural reality that set the stage for all of Plath's work.
To really understand Sylvia Plath, you absolutely have to understand the society she was reacting to. The 1950s wasn't just this happy-go-lucky era of poodle skirts and diners. It was a time of intense geopolitical anxiety, and a huge chunk of that pressure was placed squarely on the shoulders of women. Get this. In 1955, the prominent political figure Adlai Stevenson delivered the commencement address to Plath's actual graduating class at Smith College. And he explicitly told these brilliant, highly educated women that their ultimate patriotic duty, their weapon against Soviet communism was washing diapers. I mean, imagine spending 4 years achieving absolute academic excellence, only to be told your greatest contribution to the free world is making a home. No way, right?
So, this brilliantly illustrates the jarring, massive disconnect between the bouncy, upbeat expectations of the era and the crushing reality of what Betty Friedan called the problem with no name. Friedan, who was actually also a Smith College grad, noticed this widespread, completely silent dissatisfaction among suburban housewives. These were women who'd been told they should desire absolutely nothing more than glorying in their own femininity. They had everything society said they should want, yet they felt this profound, unnameable emptiness. Plath takes this exact cultural problem and just zooms way in, exploring the intense psychological toll it took on a young woman who couldn't and wouldn't just conform to it.
Which brings us to section 2. Meet Esther Greenwood, the deeply alienated protagonist of The Bell Jar.
In the novel, our semi-autobiographical lead, Esther, is navigating a 1953 magazine internship in New York. Take a look at this breakdown of the women around her. Everywhere Esther looks, she sees models of womanhood that she just cannot identify with. She's torn between the pure, wholesome Betsy and the rebellious, cynical Doreen. She admires her incredibly capable boss, JC, but feels totally disconnected from that corporate path. And then she watches her neighbor, Dodo Conway, happily raising a massive brood of kids, knowing deep down she entirely lacks that maternal instinct. Esther's inability to fit into any of these rigid boxes triggers severe alienation. It also sparks a deep metrophobia, basically a terrifying fear of becoming her own mother and sacrificing her identity. It's like a giant, impossible puzzle of identity that she just can't solve.
Moving into our third section, Under the Bell Jar. This is where we see the actual descent.
So Esther goes back home from New York only to find out she didn't get into a prestigious summer writing course. And because her entire identity was built on academic success, that fragile structure just completely collapses. This is where Plath uses a literal scientific apparatus, a bell jar, which is a glass container used to create a vacuum, as the ultimate visual metaphor for mental suffocation. It's brilliant. Esther describes sitting under this glass bell jar, stewing in her own sour air, totally cut off from the outside world. It doesn't matter where she is or who she's with. The bell jar comes down and traps her, distorting everything she looks at through its curved glass.
Now, we can literally map out Esther's terrifying descent and eventual recovery, and it gives us this raw, totally unromanticized look at what 1950s psychiatry was actually like. First, she gets pushed into the care of the patronizing Dr. Gordon, and his poorly administered electroshock therapy completely traumatizes her. This actually accelerates her decline, leading to step 2, a serious suicide attempt where she hides in a cellar hole, But thankfully, a wealthy benefactor steps in, gets Esther into an elite facility, and she finds Dr. Nolan. Under the empathetic care of a female psychiatrist, she gets proper shock therapy and real psychotherapy. And it's this careful treatment that finally, slowly, begins to lift that metaphorical bell jar so she can breathe again.
Okay, let's switch gears for Section 4, Ariel and the Blue Hour. This is Plath's ultimate poetic rebellion.
Transitioning away from her prose, we absolutely have to talk about her poetry collection, Ariel. She wrote this as her marriage was dissolving and she was heavily isolated out in the English countryside. And you'll notice a massive contrast here on the screen. While Esther Greenwood's narration in The Bell Jar is witty, sarcastic, and almost chatty, Plath's poetry in Ariel is stripped down to this uncompromising, raw, stark anger. She was living rural and alone with a toddler and an infant, and her poetic language deals head-on with the end of a fairy tale marriage, the intense, messy realities of parenthood, and just a deep-seated fury at the double standards women faced.
Love set you going like a fat gold watch. What an incredible image, right? This opens her poem Morning Song about childbirth and early motherhood. Living alone with those two small kids, Plath would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, a time she called the Blue Hour, to write these fierce, hopeful, defiant poems. Because she literally had to get her writing done before her babies woke up, this freezing, quiet, pre-dawn sanctuary became the birthplace of her absolute masterpieces. Poems like Tulips, and of course the title poem Ariel, which captures this reckless, thrilling feeling of riding a horse right into the dawn.
Now, a lot of modern readers find Ariel kind of difficult because it's so elusive and personal. But here's the trick. Don't try to solve it like a math equation. Stop asking, what does this poem mean, and start asking, what does this poem do? Just let the rhythm wash over you. Allow the evasion and that stark language to just sit there in ambiguity. Plath uses words intentionally to create an atmosphere. She wants you to feel the isolation, feel the anger, feel those sudden bursts of absolute freedom. You almost have to experience it out loud, prioritizing the feeling over immediate logical comprehension. Finally, Section 5, A Posthumous Legacy, the Myth versus the Work.
We really can't wrap up without addressing how Plath's tragic end forever altered the way audiences consumed her work. Check out this rapid, terribly tragic timeline. It shows exactly why it became virtually impossible for critics to just give her work an innocent reading, detached from her death. The Bell Jar comes out in the UK in January 1963 under a fake name, Victoria Lucas. Just 1 month later, Plath tragically dies by suicide. So when the novel finally hits the United States in 1971, the public already knew the real-life ending. Nobody was reading it as just a fictional coming-of-age story anymore. They were reading it as a psychological roadmap to a real tragedy.
And because of that, the public hungrily projected all their morbid curiosity onto the book. Critics actually admitted to having impure motives. They weren't looking for literary merit, they were looking for clues to exactly when her mind broke. Look at this review from Saul Maloff in 1971. We look for the slips and wait for the voice to crack. Our interests are clinical and prurient. It's such a fascinating, kind of dark look at how the author as a historical tragic event can completely hijack the author as a brilliant artist.
But on the flip side, underneath all that heavy mythology, you had reviewers like Robert Scholes who recognized it as a tightly crafted work of art. He praised the book as a masterful black comedy, witty, clear, and brilliant completely on its own merits. He even likened it to something Dorothy Parker might have written. It just proves how much audiences were grappling with separating Plath the brilliant writer from Plath the tragic event.
So, I want to leave you with this final, lingering thought for today's explainer. If Sylvia Plath hadn't died so tragically, would we still read her as this brilliant observer of a completely stifling generation? Or is our obsession forever trapped under the bell jar of her myth? When we read her work, are we really looking at the text, or are we just looking at her ghosts? I really hope today we've managed to lift that bell jar just a little bit, letting us appreciate the absolute brilliance of Sylvia Plath's writing exactly as it is. Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and I absolutely encourage you to go read her words for yourself.